Why is Gerald not the main villain of the play? Let's find out. Hi there, I'm Giles Goff. I'm an education writer and a recovering English teacher, and today we're looking at the character of Gerald Croft in An Inspector Calls. Gerald gets a pretty bad rap, and I really kind of want to maybe push back on that a little bit. Let's get into it. So, before we get into it on Gerald, there's an important thing I want you to know. I played Gerald back in 2014 in a production that we did. Now, why is this important? Well, I may be a bit biased towards Gerald, and the reason why is that actors have to be able to empathise with the characters they're playing. If they can't, they end up playing more caricatured representations. And the reason why that is that nobody sees themselves as the villain. Everybody sees themselves as the hero of their own story. So I might be a bit biased towards Gerald and his motivations and his actions. However, there's a lot of other critics and a lot of other teachers online who seem to be really strongly biased against him. So I want you to see this as a chance to maybe even out those two sides of things, okay? All right, now we got it. Let's move on. So Mr. Gerald Croft, the basics. He's Lord and Lady Croft's eldest son. He's recently engaged to Sheila. He had an affair with Eva Smith, or she was known as Daisy Renton at that time. He's also from the aristocracy, and as the eldest son, he'll eventually become Lord Croft. So that means Gerald is slightly higher up the social ladder than the Birlings. Remember, at this time, it's not necessarily about how much money you've got, it's about what titles you have. And the fact that his parents are Lord and Lady Croft, and there's no mention of any other sort of brothers or anything like that, the assumption is that he's the Croft's eldest son. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about what relationships were like. What was it like between a man and a woman before they got married in the Edwardian era? And the thing I want to get your head round is dating, as we understand it, didn't exist. You didn't have someone who was your girlfriend who you hung out with, and if things were going well, you maybe moved in together and then you possibly thought about getting married. We had something that was called courting back then. Let me give you an idea what that would have been like. There's no informal dating point. You're either not together or you are. So for courting, after a couple of trips out, followed by closely by a chaperone, that means somebody who can see what's going on even if they can't necessarily hear what's going on. And also the gentleman would call on the girl at home, you would meet the parents, you would meet the family, you'd see all of that. A man could declare his feelings and propose to the girl, although he'd probably run the idea by her father first. So the point I'm trying to get across to you is that Gerald and Sheila were not dating before this point, okay? He's not cheating on Sheila as we would understand it necessarily. He's obviously going off with somebody else at the same time that he's already met Sheila, so it's not great, don't get me wrong, but he's not cheating on his girlfriend. And the other thing to point out is there's no real hope of Gerald marrying Daisy. Yes, it's theoretically possible, but how can I put it? A young man who is part of the aristocracy marrying somebody who is absolutely lower working class is going to really sort of raise some eyebrows. You see it happen in the reverse in Downton Abbey, and we follow all the kind of nonsense that brings about. But there's such a strong understanding of class at this point that it's theoretically possible, but it's highly unlikely. It's like Prince William marrying somebody who's the checkout girl at Aldi. Not impossible, highly unlikely. And one thing I wanted to talk about, the big idea when it comes to Gerald, is sexism. Because Gerald only helps Daisy initially because she looks pretty and innocent. All right? He comes into the Stalls bar in the Palace Theatre. He sees her with old man Meggerty, and the phrase he says is, she looked young and fresh and charming and altogether out of place down there. So if she'd looked older and a bit more jaded, or like she was putting up a front, he might not have gotten involved. He might have just left old man Meggerty to sort of have his way with her. So even though he might not be consciously aware of it, Gerald is still acting upon a sexist impulse there. So let's look at Gerald, okay? The pros and the cons, because I have seen some really horrendous things said about him, and I want to break it down and try and be as fair and as balanced as possible. So, first of all, he gives her a place to stay and money to live on. He doesn't lie about the relationship, and this is I can't stress this enough, this is key. His details are confirmed by Eva's diary. So Gerald withholds information, Gerald downplays things, but he doesn't lie. And he gives her money at the end of the relationship to see her through for a few months. And he's genuinely saddened and shocked by her death. We can see there is an emotional connection between the two of them. And there's that line where he says, it's just hit me that the girl I knew is dead. And he takes a moment to take that in. The cons were he didn't give her her job, which would have solved her problems. I don't know if she said, oh, I used to work at Birlings and Company, but I got fired. So she might have hidden that part of her to herself. But he could have given her a job which would have given her a sustainable way out of where she was, but he didn't. And he begins a relationship with her that he knows has no hope of thriving long term. Obviously, that is not great. I am not going to defend that. What I would say is there are a lot of people, a lot of adults who have gotten themselves into a relationship and at some point, either earlier or later, have known that this relationship probably doesn't have a future and they haven't necessarily broken it off right in that moment. Obviously, as we've said, he only helps Eva because he finds her attractive. He was very quick to believe it was a hoax. He doesn't problematize it when it comes up, when he hears that there is no Inspector Gould. So some key quotes I want you to think about. He says, you seem to be a nice, well-behaved family, quite early on. That's when Mr. Birling is telling him about getting a knighthood. Obviously, Priestley is using irony, which is going to get taken apart later on. And this line here, I've suddenly realised, taking it in properly, that she's dead. It shows that Gerald, whatever you might think of him, does have a heart and he did care about this young woman. And now this one I find fascinating. Sheila says, you were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald. And he says, all right, I did for a time. Nearly any man would have done. And this is actually quite a sophisticated point here because it points to the idea that a lot of men, not necessarily all men, but a lot of men like being adored. They like being able to come in and play the hero. And because he's getting that level of adoration, that might have been a part of the reason why the relationship goes on for longer than it should do. And then, obviously, where he says, everything's all right now, Sheila. Holds up the ring. What about this ring? So, because he's found out in heavy air quotes, that Inspector Gould isn't a real person and that no girl has died, surely they can just get married again. Surely everything can go back to normal. Putting aside the fact that he had a clandestine relationship that was going on whilst he may have been courting Sheila, that Sheila had no idea about. He's very easy to just brush over the fact that he was sleeping with somebody else, which possibly links to, how can I put this, expectations of how men are supposed to act around this time. He's hoping that she will just be able to just look past this. And then another key term I want you to look at is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you are more likely to believe something that already fits with your pre-existing worldview. You might see this, sometimes something pops up on social media, and sometimes if it sounds unbelievable to you, you'll do a bit more to fact check it and have a look around it. And if it sounds like something that you already kind of believe, you probably won't fact check it that much because you'll go, well, that makes sense. So this bit where he says, I met a police sergeant I know. He swore there wasn't any Inspector Gould or anybody like him on the force here. So that links in with, as we say, the confirmation bias. Now, arguably, they do ring up. They do check the infirmary to see if anybody's come through. So it's not completely unfounded, but it does feel like he's very quick to believe it. So what do you think about Gerald? Is he a hero, a villain, or is he somewhere in the middle? Personally, I think he's somewhere in the middle. I think he's one of the most interesting characters. He's almost a bit of an anti-hero. He's not completely whiter than white like Sheila ends up being, but he's not quite as terrible as Eric or Mr. Birling or Mrs. Birling. Did I get anything wrong there? Did I say anything that wasn't quite correct? Let's talk about it in the comments. I hope that has proved useful and that's given you something for your essays. Please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.